Hi, everybody. This is Matthew Poes with Poes Acoustics. Excuse me, and I'm going to cough. And I'm going to actually talk about bass. I'm going to talk about bass again. I've talked about it a lot, and I'm going to talk about accurate bass. But I want to start before I get into this by saying this is my opinion, and your system is your system. You should do what you want. My recommendation would be try different ways of setting it up and seeing, though, if you can appreciate the way I think systems should be. I'm going to take kind of a strong stance on what I believe to be true. And I will say, one of my partners, Anthony Grimani, and I have had conversations about this, and I'm going to use his analogy. He agrees 100% with me on this, and I know others do too. Ross Taylor, who sent me the message with the idea for this video, also agrees, and we've had many conversations. Most of you have your bass levels way too high, and you enjoy listening to your systems with way too much bass. That's the controversial stance I'm going to take on that. Now, how do I know this? Because I set up systems for a lot of you. And very frequently, like as in the vast majority of times, after setting the bass levels to where they should be, and then even sometimes adding 2 or 3 dB to that, I then get told to increase it. And then when I go through the exercise I use to figure out the level you want, what I find is you don't want another 2 or 3 dB. You want like 9 to 12 dB. And that is way too much bass. But it's your system, and you should be allowed to do what you want, right? And the answer is sure, but I think there's more going on here. And I also think that there's some arguable detriments to doing it that way. So let's start with the detriments and then get into the whole why most people may actually want too much bass during these initial setups. So the reason why I think there's some detriment with this is that when the bass isn't balanced and it's not accurate, it tends to cause a lot of problems with everything going on above the bass frequencies. So when the bass is just way too intense, the clarity and the imaging become much harder to hear. And so all that mid-range, and by clarity, I mean like what you're hearing, the voice clarity, the ability to recognize what people are saying and attend to speech, the ability to hear all the fine details of what's happening in the soundtrack or in the music, all that tends to be lost in the mud of that booming bass. And so by having the bass levels that loud, it really can cause a significant difficulty, a sort of masking of everything that we pay so much time and money and attention to in these systems. There's another issue, which is that it is a coloration. You know, we talk about like resonances being a problem. If a speaker had elevated treble like that, nobody would call that a good thing. They would say the speaker is way too bright and it's very colored. Well, the same thing with the bass. When the bass level is too elevated, it is a coloration. And often, depending on where the rise in bass is happening most, that coloration can be pretty significant. So I actually think there's something to be said for looking at things like equal loudness curves and boosting the deep bass. But there's this range between about 50 hertz and 200 hertz where there really shouldn't be a very significant boost. And boosting heavily there actually starts to impact things like the lower register of male voices. And so it's adding a coloration and it affects clarity. So in my opinion, and my preference for my own system, is to at least have a preset that puts the bass levels at a proper level. Now, proper does not mean dead flat. As we know from things like some of the work that Harman did, that Brüel and Kesher did, and other companies, there is a desire to have elevated bass, but it's not that elevated. You know, we're talking about, I think it's like 6 to 10 dB from 20 kilohertz to 20 hertz. And if you come up with the target curves that people seem to like the sound of most, there was actually a Harman project that looked at room target curves, and they had people play around with some knobs to try to get the level that was right. What they preferred was not actually like a wedge shape. It was basically flat in the mid-range, a little bit shelved down in the treble, and a little bit shelved up, about 4 to 6 dB shelved up in the bass. Some people preferred it more like 2 or 3 dB, some people more than that. And actually, most untrained amateur listeners tend to prefer even higher levels of bass, which gets us to this whole video. It is really common. So Anthony and I have had many conversations about this because we run into it. I think his preference is to always set up a system as neutral and just get people to deal with it. I do like to give people options, including even I have that. I mean, I like to have like a bass boosted mode and then have a more neutral mode and like an even more neutral mode. And part of that comes from music, can be all over the place too. And so, you know, more neutral meaning like a more flat response, neutral meaning it falls within the realm of what seems to be considered accurate, but is boosted a bit, maybe 4 or 5 dB in the bass. And then I have, usually have one that's like 12 dB up in the bass that's just to have people over and make their hair flap and make them think it's fun. I don't actually like listening like that, but it's nice to have the preset available for those who want that. But I've done calibrations on systems before where even like good integrators who should know what they're talking about are like, that sounds terrible. And what they really mean is it's not the aggressive, intense, over-the-top amount of bass they want. And sure enough, I can make them think it sounds great by just adding a ton of boost to the bass. That doesn't mean they're right. It isn't really the right way to do it. Like I said, there is some research behind what should be right, including there's just common sense on that. You know, there's rationale behind why, based on the way sound energy reflects in a room, that there's going to be a natural bit of boost in the bass and why you don't want it to be dead flat, to be perceived as neutral. That same research supports the idea, though, that there's a limit to what that should look like, and it certainly should not be 12 plus dB below 100 hertz. So let's get into the analogy. Anthony refers to it as like salt. A lot of people, myself included, I'm sure many of you, like too much salt in our food. And one of the things we know about salt is that it's not uncommon for people to have oversalted their food for so many years that they've lost their taste for salt. And so you end up having to keep adding more and more salt to make it taste salty. The problem with that is salt is unhealthy, especially in large quantities. Yes, we need electrolytes. Salt is a component of the electrolytes we need to function. Salt is key to our survival. Had there not been salty oceans, we wouldn't have life the way we do. There is more than enough salt in everything you eat day to day to have enough salt in your diet. You would have to actively avoid salt to cause a problem. So adding salt to your food is actually not necessary for our survival. It's just something we do for flavor. And we all do it, and it's okay, as long as it's done in moderation. But the point, the analogy is that because we've oversalted our food so much, we've become so used to it, we need to add more salt for it to taste salty. And with music, it's kind of the same thing. Bass is like salt. When you become so accustomed to over-the-top bass, you have to add ever more for it to sound too bassy or over-the-top. Reality is you can, just like with salt, you can step yourself down and then eventually get used to lower amounts of salt such that smaller increments above that would taste salty again. You can do that with bass. You can get yourself used to normal bass levels, which are accurate, and then smaller increments above that would sound more bassy. Whereas probably right now, if you're used to that really aggressive amount of bass, it's not gonna. So with that in mind, one of the things you may try is to wean yourself off, like an alcoholic. You're a bassaholic. So as a bassaholic, wean yourself off, get your bass level back to a more reasonable level, and then from there, once you're kind of used to what it's supposed to sound like, you can give yourself a preset that raises it maybe 2 or 3 dB, and that's your big bass boosted mode. But then you're no longer in that really aggressive high amount. And there's a number of advantages. As I said, one of the biggest ones is the system overall is just going to sound better. You're going to have more clarity. You're going to hear fine details that were lost before. The other part of it is it gives your system back some headroom. Because if you've got the bass boosted that much, you're hitting the max output of your system that much sooner because the subwoofer is basically becoming the limiting factor. It's one of the reasons why you see people sometimes do systems with 8, 10, 12 giant subwoofers in the room is that they've got it so boosted that to give themselves enough headroom to be able to play movie soundtracks back at reference levels in the mid-range and highs, the bass now, the bass is probably hitting that 125 to 130 dB. And to do that at the listening position requires an awful lot of subwoofers. It just gets exponentially larger, in a sense, to do that. But a much simpler, easier thing is just get yourself used to a normal bass level. And then, like I said, a small increase of 2 or 3 dB would sound like it's more aggressive and gives you what you're looking for. I think the other thing that happens, and again, raising the bass level isn't the solution to this, is that people are seeking tactile bass, and because they're not getting it, they're just boosting the bass. But I already did a video on this, and it absolutely holds true. The reason why you're not getting good tactile bass is not because you don't have enough subwoofers. It could be. If you've got like a single 8-inch subwoofer, probably no room you put it in, it's going to shake like crazy. But I had in this room, remember, this room is a little under 19 feet long, it's a little under 16 feet wide, and it's a little under 10 feet tall, a couple inches in each direction. Basically, that was the dimensions of the room, or what it would have been had we not sound isolated it. So it would have been about 19 or 20 feet long, it would have been about 16 and a half feet wide, and it would have been, 10 and a half feet tall, and then we put in all the sound ISO stuff and lost some space, and the floor floats. And I had that speaker, I've talked about it quite a bit, I got it as a review sample. So it's that orb-shaped speaker from, what are they called? The I'm going to forget the name of this thing. Anyway, it's got two, I think they're like 6.5 or 7-inch woofers in it. High excursion. They're in the top and the bottom. Sing cells. That's the sing cell alpha. So I had two of those sing cell alphas in here in a left and a right position. For the sake of argument, this thing is roughly equal to like 2 microsubs. It shook the hell out of this room. I mean, it really was shaking the room a lot. It was an intense amount of bass. I had people over. I was like, you got to check this out. I can't believe what these things are doing. I stuck them in my bedroom later. I mean, the bass is really good on those little tiny speakers for what they are, but it wasn't anywhere near what it was up here on a concrete floor. Put them in my family room. They didn't even sound that impressive. I mean, it was good, but it just nowhere near what I was getting in this theater room. The reason it shook so much and it was so intense is that the inertial energy needed was much lower because all you had to do was shake this floating floor, not the whole house. So knowing that, I know that, for instance, this room doesn't need a lot to shake like crazy, and you wouldn't either if you built a room like this. The reason that we are boosting the bass over and over again to higher levels often is either, like I said, you got used to way too much bass, or you got used to way too much bass because you wanted that visceral part and you were seeking it through the wrong channel. Ultimately, making your floor float would be a more efficient way of doing that. I think people are often afraid of construction, and they would rather go and spend $20,000 or $30,000 on tons of subwoofers than to spend that same $20,000 or $30,000 on reconstructing the room to meet their needs. I have to say, it doesn't even need to cost that. It would not cost you $20,000 to take the floor up and put down a floating floor. You should consider it more as a not either or, but both, and not be so afraid of construction. You know, we often hear about people who like don't want to rip up drywall to put like an in-wall subwoofer in or something like that. It seems like a lot. Yeah, it makes a mess. Yes, it's going to take longer than just a different product, but it may be the better solution, and it's not that big a deal. So to the point of all this, let's get used to more appropriate bass levels. I think ultimately you're going to actually be happier. And if what you're seeking is more visceral bass, just remember there's a better and more faster, efficient solution towards getting that more visceral bass. And it's not bigger and more subwoofers. It's making your room float. So I hope this was helpful. Keep watching the videos. And if I offended you, I'm sorry, but hey, put it in the comments and we'll get into it. We can have some conversations about that. As I said at the beginning, this is my opinion, and it's your room and your system, and you should do what you want. You don't have to listen to me.